you're right. I did not know this historical character, this man, and there's a ton of pretty dry nonfiction to read, which I bore through, and just to get a sense of who he was and where he was at what time. You know, it's a 700-year-old man and story, so the information on him is much, but little in the way of kind of psychoanalytic. There's no, My Memoir, My Life by Robert Bruce. So there was that aspect of it, and then obviously riding a horse and the accent and swords and whatnot, so there was plenty of that. And really the reason I jumped in was because of David. I had a beautiful experience making our last film, and I've made a lot of big films, but I've never made a big film with a man or a human or a director or an artist of the sensibility of David's, and we like to call it jazz filmmaking, where you you have a structure, but there's room to play the note of I don't know, and there's much of this man that we jumped into this thinking I don't really know what he's thinking or why or where, the wherefore, and I love that, and because David calls them happy mistakes, but there's a floating rhythm you can get in there that's terrifying but very, very fun.
Mackenzie has this innate ability to create such an authentic environment, and it just allows the actors to play and let go and really immerse themselves in that period in time. And I think that's what Chris was saying about that jazz sense of filmmaking. I mean, improvising, right? But yeah, we spent weeks and months training to learn stunt sequences and stuff. But that's different when you're in your joggers and Nikes and then you're rolling around some pads to being completely covered in chainmail and weapons on you, and then you're running through the bog or you're going through a lock and it's freezing cold weather, and like you said, the elements in this played such a huge part, and there was no time to think what was my next line or what am I going to do next. It was all unpredictable.
He's a very interesting character, and my approach to it, I mean, the way you just described him, in the latter part of the film, kind of is him trying to fill the boots of his father. His father, the king, Edward I, who, historically was this great tactician, this warmonger, and also quite brilliant politician, who kept this equilibrium, between, the region of Scotland and England, as was for a very long time. And so obviously when this act of rebellion, occurs, Edward has to, the Prince of Wales has to, suddenly step up to the mark, and, is he adequate? And that's brought into question. So there's a real sort of balance of his ineptitude, perhaps, and the need or desire to impress his father.
But before we started shooting, I went over to Iona, where Angus is his grave slab, where he was buried, and a lot of the lords and sort of knights were buried, sort of the kind of the beginnings of Christianity, basically on that island, or certainly in Scotland anyway. And yeah, I went over there and I just sort of raised a wee dram of single malt to Angus and just and touched the stone. It was pretty trippy, I have to say, and I think it's on Latin. It says on his gravestone, from Bruce, one more push, Scotland's free, Lord of the Isles, my trusted knee. So, he was. They were pretty tight.
I don't honestly think that a studio would have financed this film and allowed us to make this film. Certainly not in the way we did. So, thank you to Netflix for letting us do it. One of the things we're very careful about doing is not playing too much into the jingoism and nationalist idea. It's an old story where the world was a very, very different place. You look at the map of the world then, it's centered around Europe, and that's it. You know what I mean? The world now is a completely different thing. So I'm nervous about contemporary parallels with the movie for obvious reasons, but I'm determined that the kind of conclusion we made in the movie was a sort of compassion is not weakness, which is the line that Florence says. There was something about that in there as well as everything else. and that we don't play too heavily into jingoistic ideas.
Power and the relationship with current politics. I think what turned me on about this story was A, David's involvement, and B, our desire to investigate a human being who comes from great wealth and great privilege, all of these qualities and things that in our Western society are deemed the most valuable, which is essentially power and the concentration of wealth and power, and how this man who comes from great wealth and power decides in a very difficult time to give up all of that pedigree and prestige and all of that safety for a very uncomfortable and unsafe environment where he puts his family at risk. And in that capacity, then is able to do something great for many, many people. And whatever relationship or whatever connections you want to make to the administration, what's happening in our country, America, I think the archetype that we're putting out there, or the notion is that there is hope in the possibility of doing selfless acts. And that is usually on the hero journey, and that Campbellian thing, usually what we always put out there is selfless is better than selfish, always. I mean, the stories are just ad infinitum all over the place in storytelling, and that deserves to be told over and over again, otherwise we'd just be a bunch of selfish assholes, I think. What I find really interesting is that obviously, I mean, I could answer that in a pithy way, I just don't, we all have certain body parts, and so people want to talk about that, yet there's so much deboweling and beheading in this film, it nearly makes your mind spin. That somehow to a human modern audience is not nearly as interesting or revelatory or exclamatory than someone showing A, a sex scene, or B, their penis. I think we as human beings should probably take a minute just to like gestate and really meditate on that. That in this kind of Western society, in this puritanical society, to show people making love, to show what we all have, is somehow a Google alert. It's a trip. I mean, it's really, if you sit and think about it for a second, it's a trip. David and I talked a lot about this. Underneath the emperor's clothes, it's human beings are mewling, puking children. So beneath President Trump and Merkel and everyone, they're all naked people that eat shit, have sex, do all the things that we do. And I thought it was really important to show that we are animals, ultimately. And there's a final scene in the film where I say that we're beasts. It's not about God, and it's not about words. It's not about nothing more than like we're animals on the savannah, and that tiger's going to come over, and one of these animals is going to win. Sorry I get so impassioned about it, but I think it's really, I think it's something, I think it's a tribute to David's interest in the human existence, that we should think about these things, is that we have cell phones, but really ultimately we're trying to kill one another and trying to dominate other people. And that's the animal within all of us. So I thought it was important to show that.
But this is a huge ensemble, and it's a real privilege to be with this sort of band of guys, and Florence Pugh, who stands out fantastically in this movie also. But I think we all just tackle our work the best we can, and it was
needed. Sorry, Aaron. It needed a bit of levity. This film at times, a little bit of sex. Oh, look, there's someone's cock, and then some boobies and a bit of a laugh. You know, let's do some more chopping of the head, shall we?
Okay, well,
Let's
so
just
it's
lock
so it's
the
so it's
bastard's
dark
bolt.
and it's brutal, and yeah, absolutely. I think there is that sense of, these are a band of brothers, and there's a military sense of these guys were on the road and tour together, and there needs to be that kind of banter also, and we had to find what that was. And I think, we found it interesting, Tony and I, to have this kind of almost dynamic to fight over, this man's attention all the time, because we both wanted to be the right-hand man. So we kind of had this little ongoing thing that if any moment we can, let's try and push each other's buttons, and that's always kind of a nice incentive for an actor to have in a scene, to get this point across, but also be able to play on the side of that with another kind of dynamic, and so those themes were fun to play.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey, you guys!